I'm Eleanor, a 28-year-old graphic designer who recently achieved what I thought was the ultimate milestone, buying my first home. It's something I've dreamed about since I was a teenager, working part-time jobs and saving every extra dollar in hopes of one day finding a place that was truly mine. After years of sharing cramped apartments with roommates and bouncing from one rental to the next, I was more than ready to settle down in a house I could finally call my own. I thought I'd found the perfect sanctuary, a home where I could finally escape the noise, drama, and limitations of shared living spaces. But now, as I sit on the front porch of this supposed dream home, my entire body is tense, my heart pounding. Everything I thought I wanted is turning into something darker, something I can't control or even fully understand. The house itself seemed almost too good to be true. It was a classic Victorian-style place on a quiet, tree-lined street, with 2 stories, a cozy attic, and large windows that let in perfect streams of sunlight. The first time I walked through the arched wooden doors, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was a little out of my budget, but the price had been slashed right before I came across it. I didn't question why, it felt like fate, and I convinced myself I'd landed an amazing deal. So I worked out a way to stretch my savings and close the deal. The first few weeks in the house were blissful. The hardwood floors had a comforting creak, and I loved the subtle scent of cedar that lingered in the air. I spent my days moving in, decorating, arranging my furniture just so. Every evening, I'd sit on the couch with a cup of tea and soak in the quiet, relieved that I'd finally found my sanctuary. I even called my best friend, Clara, nearly every day, telling her how perfect everything was. I finally did it, I'd say, over and over, feeling almost like I had to pinch myself to believe it was real. Then, strange things started happening. At first, I told myself they were just odd coincidences. A couple of weeks after moving in, I found a letter slipped under my front door. No stamp, no return address. It was just a plain envelope with my name written in neat cursive handwriting. Curious, I opened it, expecting some welcome message from a neighbor, maybe. But all it contained was a single sheet of paper with 3 words. "Welcome home, Eleanor." My first reaction was a mix of surprise and unease. How did someone know my name? I hadn't introduced myself to anyone in the neighborhood yet. And why didn't they just ring the doorbell? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably a harmless greeting from a neighbor who wanted to welcome me in their own quirky way. But then another note came a few days later. This time, I found it on the kitchen counter, right near the sink, when I was sure I'd left the kitchen window closed all night. The note was written in the same cursive handwriting, but this one was a little more unsettling. "I see you've redecorated." This sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the changes I was making: a fresh coat of paint in the living room, some new curtains, a couple of new pieces of furniture. Only Clara, who'd been over a few times, knew about the updates. So who could have left this note, and how did they know I'd redecorated? I tried to brush it off as a weird prank or even a mistake. Maybe a previous owner had left these things behind, or maybe a nosy neighbor was sneaking in while I was away. But the fear in the back of my mind was growing. I started locking every door and window, double-checking everything before going to bed. I told Clara about the notes, half joking that maybe my new house was haunted, but I think she could tell I was nervous. She offered to come over more often, maybe even stay the night, but I assured her it was probably nothing. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft creak above me in the middle of the night. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the noises kept coming back. Every night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd wake up to a rhythmic creaking coming from the attic, directly above my bedroom. I was too scared to go up there alone, especially in the dark, but I couldn't bring myself to ignore it any longer. So one night, heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up the narrow staircase to the attic. The attic was cold and smelled of dust. The only light came from my flashlight, casting eerie shadows across the wooden floor. As I scanned the room, I noticed that everything seemed to be in its place: boxes of old clothes, a few holiday decorations, an antique rocking chair left by the previous owner. But then I noticed something strange on the floor. In the thin layer of dust, I could make out what looked like footprints, leading from the far corner of the attic to the window. They were large, more like boot prints than shoes, and I knew they weren't mine. I felt a wave of panic, and I bolted out of the attic, barely remembering to close the door behind me. That night, I barely slept, the image of those footprints seared into my mind. I tried to tell myself that maybe I'd overlooked them before, that they were from a maintenance worker or someone else who'd been in the house before I moved in. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard a noise downstairs. It sounded like a soft rustling, almost like someone was moving around in the living room. I grabbed my phone and dialed Clara's number, whispering for her to come over. She arrived 10 minutes later, and together we searched the entire house, but there was no sign of anyone. I could tell she thought I was overreacting, but she promised to stay with me that night. The next day, I decided to install a few security cameras around the house. I set them up in the living room, kitchen, and attic, hoping to catch whatever or whoever was causing these disturbances. For a few days, everything was quiet. I even started to relax a little, telling myself that maybe it had all been my imagination, a result of moving stress. Then, one night around AM, I was woken by a notification from the attic camera. I opened the app on my phone and froze. There, in the dark, grainy feed, I could see movement near the window. It was subtle at first, just a shadow shifting in the corner. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when suddenly, a figure stepped into view. It was a woman. Her face was obscured, but I could see her long hair hanging loosely over her shoulders and the outline of a pale, thin dress. She stood still for a few seconds, staring directly at the camera, before turning and disappearing into the shadows. I screamed, the sound echoing through my empty house. My hands shook as I tried to call Clara, but I couldn't get the words out to explain what I'd just seen. She arrived 20 minutes later, and together, we replayed the footage. But the strange thing was, there was nothing there. The camera hadn't recorded anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the figure had never appeared at all. From that night on, I knew I couldn't stay in that house alone. I started sleeping with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. I even thought about moving out, but I'd invested so much in this place, both financially and emotionally. I didn't want to give up so easily. One afternoon, I decided to do some research on the house, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. I learned that the previous owner, a woman named Martha, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. She'd lived in the house for over 20 years, but one night, she disappeared without a trace. Some people said she'd moved away, but there were rumors that she'd been deeply disturbed, obsessed with the idea that her deceased husband and daughter were still in the house. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who knew about the area's history. He hesitated before telling me more. Apparently, Martha had spent countless nights in the attic, talking to her family, and eventually, the neighbors had stopped visiting her altogether. She'd become a ghost herself in a way, never seen during the day, only occasionally glimpsed in the attic window. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to go back up to the attic one last time. This time, I went in the daylight, carrying a candle and a small vial of salt, hoping these things would offer some sort of protection. As I stood in the middle of the room, I called out her name, feeling foolish but desperate. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, I felt a presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me. I spun around, heart hammering, and there she was, standing in the corner, her hollow eyes fixed on me. Her face was gaunt, pale, and twisted with anger. She pointed at the door, her lips parting to form a single word. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled out of the attic, down the stairs, and out of the house, never looking back. That night, I packed a bag and left, never returning to my dream home.